recording this, and I'm gonna minimize this for now. But if I hear you guys talking or hear a chat or something like that, I'll bring it back up. So one thing that I want to do, so I'm gonna work mostly in Godot today, but I'm gonna open up my project folder. And one thing that I want to do is, if I go to my sprites and I look at my auto tile set, I'm gonna be adding some more platforms and stuff. And the auto tile set has this kind of like water background on it. And for a 2D platformer, I realized I probably don't really want that in there because I'm gonna have a separate background later. And so I don't really have to want to worry about filling in all the background colors and stuff. I guess I could just make the background the same color, but then there might be some stuff that's overlapping and stuff. Anyway, I think it's going to be easier just to have some transparent option for this. So I'm going to go to scale and just fill in the blue with some transparency just to make this a little bit easier. So I'm just going to drag this on here and import. And I'm just going to take my paint all pixels tool, and my secondary color is actually already by default transparent. So if I just right click, it'll fill in all of that stuff with transparency. So that looks good. Everything, that's pretty easy. So I'm gonna export this and just put it here, and I'll just put it as auto tile 3x3, and I'll put platformer at the end just so I can remember which one that is. And so that should be pretty easy to fill in. Oh, I don't need to really save the Pascal, that's fine. Okay. Did it actually got in here? Yeah, there it is. Okay, so let's leave Pascal. Okay, so now let's go to Godot. So I'm gonna go back to my game and open up project.godot, choose the Godot engine. And so I'm gonna start with a new scene. The scene that I have already set up that I've kind of been working with is this default scene here, which is kind of like a RPG style scene where the player just walks around and there's some stuff in the scene. But what I wanna do now is make a platformer scene. So I'm gonna start from scratch. I'm gonna go to scenes, to the scenes folder and right click and create a new scene. And I'll just call this platformer scene. And so this will just be an example. You know, if this was like a specific level, I could call this like level 1 or something like that. But we'll do that when we go over level design. So I've got my platformer scene, and I'm gonna choose the root node as a 2D scene, and I'll call this platformer. Okay, so I want to add in a tile set. And so I don't know if I've gone over this before, but it's always good to review things. I think I may have, but I don't really remember. But I want to add some stuff into the scene without having to like copy and paste or you know, rebuild it. So in my default scene, there's actually a lot of stuff that's still pretty useful, like my player, this tile map. I can reset it with some new tiles. The scenery could be useful. The items could be useful. So there's a bunch of stuff in here that's useful to have set up and not have to redo. And there's a really easy way to do that in Godot, which is by merging. So if I right click on the platformer node, the main node, and I go to merge from scene, it brings up my dialog window with all my folders and stuff. And I can go into the scenes folder and choose my default scene and click open. And so look, this is the same as what I would normally see in my scene hierarchy. And it's all the nodes that are in my default scene. So if I want my player here, I can just select the player node, click OK, and there's my player. I don't have to like change anything. It's already set up right there. So that's convenient. And let's see, what else do I want? So I also want to put in my tile map. So I'm going to go to merge and choose a default scene again and put in my tile map. And can I do more than one at a time? Yeah, I can shift. I want my scene manager too, so I'm going to put those in there. Okay, so now I've got my tile map and my scene manager. And I also want my auto tile map, which is in a different scene. So I'm gonna right click again and merge from scene. And so my auto tile map is in my auto tile scene. Or this is a different auto tile map, it's the simple one. So I want that as well. I'm gonna click open. Forget if this is tile map or tile map 2. I should have named this a little bit better. Let's just try tile map. Okay, that looks good. I'm gonna put this as simple auto, and this is my 3x3 auto. And so I just need to set up my scene a little bit. I'm gonna delete the tiles I have in the simple auto. So I'm gonna click on this and hold shift and control and right click and just delete everything. And now I'm gonna do the same thing here, get rid of everything. Then I'm gonna go to my 3x3 auto and replace this art. So I have a tile set already here. And what I'll do is just duplicate that so I don't have to recreate the whole thing. And, oh wait, did I already do this? I already have one down here. Oh, that's the one I did just with the colliders. So that's the one I should actually duplicate. So let me right click and duplicate this one. And this is platforms. I'll call this transparent. I have a lot of different stuff in here. Getting a little complicated, but that's okay. And so let's load this one. So I'm gonna go to load file sets and get my transparent one. And so this is just a copy of the other one that I have, but if I click on this and just replace the art, it should work. Hopefully, let's see if I can do that. So I'll go to sprites, and here's the platformer, and put it there. Oh, it doesn't let me do it. Okay, so maybe I can't just replace that. Wait, what if I click on this? And replace the art. No, okay, that's okay. So I'll just go here. I just need to redraw this bitmap. See. I copy this. So I have to, the bit mask is easy. The one that takes a long time is the collisions. Okay, I'm gonna skip this for now. I'll do this later and we can add some stuff in, but for now I'll just stick with this simple tile map because this isn't really necessary. So I'll just go to the simple tile map and just give my player something to stand on right here. Okay. And so then we need to add in some physics, and let's give him a couple more tiles to jump on. So I'll put one up here, put one over here, maybe one down here. Give him some stuff to go to. Okay, so we need to add some physics so my player can actually jump between these different tiles. So I'm gonna click on the player, and we have this player controller script. And so if I preview this scene, the player is just gonna stay there in the air, and I can move him around and nothing really happens. So what we need to happen is for gravity to be applied to the player. And that's something that we can do through our code. Godot is used to that. It's something that Godot expects. So it has some built-in functions that we can use to calculate the speed of the player and the velocity and different things like that. So we're gonna implement our script. And there's a couple different ways to do this. We could make a new script. I'm just gonna make some values with the script that already exists. And so I think if we look at the lab for the player physics, let's open this lab. So this is its own script, but we can just set it to check if we're using the gravity, and then do different stuff if we're using gravity. So that way we just have one script. It might be a little bit simpler, but as usual, you can grab these scripts from the assets folder and just put them in. You don't necessarily need them all to work. All right, so I have a whole bunch of scripts in here. Let's close everything except my player controller. So I had the player and I clicked on the script, and this brings me over to the script area. I have a whole bunch of scripts, so I'm going to click on the player controller and go to File, and then close other tabs. So now I just have one script to worry about. And so let's add in a variable just to kind of tell the player that we're going to use some gravity. So we're going to say export var use gravity. And what we'll do is we'll make this false by default, but we can turn it on to add gravity into our scene. And so if we are going to use gravity, we need some variables for gravity. And these are variables that we also want to make export variables because we want to be able to change them. You might have different scenes that have different amounts of gravity. Like if you have an underwater scene, you might need less gravity if you're like floating around. If you have like a space scene, you might want to, have a little bit of gravity. Or if you have like different planets or something like that. Or if you just want your player to jump higher in some levels. So we want to be able to set the amount of gravity in the scene. So we're going to make another export var gravity, and this is the actual value of gravity. And we can tweak this. I'm going to check what I put in the example. So the gravity I put was 800. So that's pretty high, but I think that's fine. So we can put some gravity here. And now, what else do we need? We need a couple more variables. We need a jump force for the player to jump. So that'll be opposed to gravity. So I'm going to say export var jump force. And this is about half of how much gravity there is. And let's see. The other stuff in here, we don't quite need this yet. We'll add this later. Oh, we do need to track whether or not the player is jumping. So that's another variable that I need. And that's not an export variable. We don't need to set that at the beginning. So that's going to go down here. Variable is jumping. So we need to keep track of whether or not the player is jumping so we can set the animations and play sounds and stuff like that. So I'm going to say is jumping, and we'll set that to false to begin. Okay. So now we're going to move to our physics process, and this is where we update the player movement. And so I have an update movement function here, which does some basic stuff with the kind of assumption that we're just moving in 4 directions. But what we can do is use an if statement to call a different function if we're using gravity. And this function will look pretty similar. So we're going to be duplicating a little bit of stuff, but that's okay. So what we can do, well, actually, let's just write a new function so that we can go over how to do that again. So I'm going to close this function up, and I'm going to make a new function called func update movement. And let's call this platformer, or yeah, we can call it platformer. Really, we just need something different to distinguish these two parts of our code. And so then up here, instead of calling update movement, we can add another if statement. So we can say if use gravity, then we'll update movement platformer, and we'll put the change in time there. And then else we'll say update movement, the normal 4 direction update movement. So this is a good thing to go over because we can show that we can actually use multiple if statements within. So I have this one if statement saying if we're alive and we're moving, then we want to update our movement, but there's a further condition. If we're using gravity, we want to move with the platformer. And if we're not using gravity, we want to do update movement. So this way, we know that we're going to be jumping and doing other things in our update movement function. Okay, so there's going to be a few differences here. So if we're updating our movement, one thing that we did in the regular update movement function is we reset the y velocity every time. And that's because we want our player to be standing on the ground. They're not falling through the sky. But we can't do this with our gravity, and that has to do with how gravity works. So let's talk a little bit about what that means. So I'm gonna get my drawing tool for a second. And so if our player is here, and we have a platform down here, and we're applying gravity. So in code, when we're adding forces, it's not like, real forces. We're just using numbers to approximate or simulate what happens in the real world. And one of those things is gravity. The way that gravity works is it's not one constant speed. So if gravity, let's say gravity was, we set it to 800, and let's say this is how far 800 gravity goes. And so if we have this as like one frame, and then this is one frame, and then this is one frame. So if we just applied the same amount of gravity every frame, the player would just fall in a kind of like smooth straight line. It wouldn't look very realistic. The way that gravity actually works is that it's multiplied each frame, or it's added each frame. So if the first frame looks like this, the next frame is actually like this. The longer the player's falling, the farther they fall for each frame. That's how gravity works in the real world. As you fall faster and faster and faster. And so we don't want to reset the value of y when we're using gravity. And then we don't have to reset the value of x. It kind of depends on what you want your movement to look like, if there's more or less sliding. So for now, I'm going to set velocity.x to 0 to reset that value. But we can turn that off later and see how it makes a difference. So then the next thing, we still have to capture the player input, but we want to capture the jumping input first, I think. Let me double check. Oh, no, I did it. Oh, no, okay, we did it later. Okay, so first we want to just check the right and left movement. And we can just copy this from here. So it's the same exact process of what we had in our update movement. So I'm going to copy these guys and just paste them here. But we can't move up and down. That's going to be handled by jumping. So I'm going to copy just the right and left movement. And then I also can copy this move and slide function because we're going to use that as well. So that's where the similarities end. So I'm going to close the update movement function and go back to the update movement platformer function. And okay, let's take a look. So in our script, so we reset the x value of the velocity, then we apply the speed, and notice there's a slight difference here. It's easy to miss, but you can see instead of using equals speed, I'm using a different value, which is minus equals speed. And this is a similar difference. Instead of for directional movement, the way that it usually works is that we have our player, and if we hit the right arrow, they just move that far right. And if we hit it again, they keep moving, and they keep moving. But in a platformer, we want to actually increase the speed as we move. So instead of just setting this value to always be the same, what we can do instead is subtract it from the current value. And it's not going to make a difference if we're resetting the value to 0, but it gives us the option of turning this off. We could make another Boolean for that. Maybe we'll actually add that later. That's not in the example code, but we can add that pretty easily. But anyway, so we're just going to change this to plus equal. So instead of just setting the speed directly, we're actually going to add to the speed. And for this one, we can do the same thing. We can say plus equals negative speed, or we can change this to minus equals speed. So for when we hit right, we're going to move to the right. When we hit left, we're going to subtract from the x to move to the left. So then we apply our move and slide. And then we're going to detect a button press for jumping. So that uses the same basic function. There's a bunch of stuff in here. I might ignore this part for today. We'll see. But the main thing we want to do here is if we hit the jump button, then we want to apply the jump force. So this happens after our move and slide. We say if input.is action, and this one I'm going to use something slightly different. For the right and left movement, I'm using is action pressed, which means that as long as I'm holding the button, I'm going to move to the right. But for the jump, my player should only be able to jump once at a time. You can implement a double jump if you want, but for this basic physics example, I'm just gonna have one jump. And so I only wanna record the beginning of the press, not if the player is holding the button down the whole time. I'm gonna go to is action just pressed, and I'm gonna find my jump action. That's something that we added in our project settings. So if you don't see that, you can add it in there. I think we talked about that in the Godot intro. And so then I put a colon after here. So if the input action is just pressed, then we're gonna update our velocity.y, and we're gonna subtract the jump force. So keep in mind, it's a little counterintuitive, but in Godot and a lot of graphic systems, the top left corner of our game window is 0, 0. And so X increases this way, but Y actually increases this way. And so if our character is here and we want them to go this way, we actually need to subtract not Y, but the jump force. So that's why we're subtracting the jump force from the velocity rather than adding it. So then for our animation, we want to say is jumping equals true. And we'll reset that later when our player hits the ground. And then we want to play our animated sprite. We're going to reset the animated sprite frame to 0. And that just happens to make sure that the jump starts at the beginning. Because you could, depending on the different circumstances, you could land your jump in the middle of an animation. And so we want to make sure to start the animated sprite dot frame equals 0. So that'll restart our jump animation, and our update animation function is down here. So we'll do that in a second. That's in a separate area. So it's a little bit different from the example code, but we just have to add this code in here. Okay, so this should work now. Let's give this a try. So I'm gonna hit play, and oh, I forgot to apply the gravity. Whoops. Okay. So that's one thing that we need to remember to do, which is right here after we do our velocity, we have to apply our gravity. So I'm going to say velocity.y, and I'm going to say the times equals or plus equals gravity times delta. Plus equals gravity times delta. Okay, so the reason you might be wondering why I'm using times delta here, but not in other places. And the reason for that is that move and slide actually takes the delta into account. So remember, we get this delta value. Oops. Let's close this output a second. Okay. So we get this delta value. This is the change in time between frames. So when our game is running, it's trying to go 60 frames per second, and every 60th of a second, so that's something like 0.1, what is it? It's like 0.16 seconds, something just like really, really, really short. So every like 0.16 seconds, we're gonna draw where our player is in the game. And this number is not always exact. So if we're trying to animate our player moving forward, if we want to make it look consistent, we can't just like move by 1 each frame, because this number might be a little bit different. It might be 0.15 one frame, it might be 0.17 one frame. However, you know, the computer is going to try its best to do 0.16 or 60 frames per second. But if it takes a long time to process something, it might go a little bit over. And then on the next frame, it might try to compensate by being shorter. So it's not always going to be exactly perfect. So we need to include the time in our physical forces. So we have to say gravity times delta to tie the gravity to this time of the game engine. The reason that we don't have to do it with our move and slide function is because move and slide actually does it for us. So that's why we don't see the delta being used previously. Okay, so let's try it again now that we've actually applied the gravity to the player. Still not going. Oh, because I haven't set the player values. Okay, so I have to tell the player I want to use gravity. Now we should go. Okay, there we go. So now the player is using gravity. Notice the animations are not really working, but we're going to fix that in a second. And my jump doesn't seem to be working either. So let me double check why that is. I might need more jump force. Let's try increasing the jump force to 800. If that. Oh, there we go. Okay, so I needed a little more jump force. But now I also need to not be able to jump twice. So we have to fix a couple things here, but we're getting a little bit closer to a platformer. So let's see, can I jump? I'm gonna need a lot more jump force because the only reason I'm jumping more, I might need less gravity. I don't know why it seems like these values are kind of off, but we can fix it. Okay, so we are jumping. We have to fix a couple things. Let's look at the script again and make sure velocity.y plus equals gravity. Okay. Delta, that's the same. And gravity minus equals jump force. That's also good. Okay, I don't think I'm missing anything. I don't know why the gravity seems to be too heavy, but we can balance it a little bit better. That's another good reason to have these export variables, because I can play around with these different values in the editor instead of necessarily having to always change the code. But let's fix a couple things. So one thing you probably noticed is that I can jump as many times as I hit the X button, and that's not what I want to do. So we have to add in a check to make sure that I can jump. And so there's a few different ways to do this. I'm gonna add in a simple way to do it, and then if we have time, we'll make it a little more complicated. So if the input action just pressed is jump, I'm gonna say and is on floor. So is on floor is a function that Godot gives us out of the box that tells me if my player is standing on some type of a platform. And so now I can only jump once. Although my jump seems to have very different. Sometimes I'm jumping pretty high. Sometimes I'm jumping just a tiny bit. I wonder what deal with that. Anything that would be causing that. Okay. Yeah, sometimes the jump is just really small. And doing anything weird? Fine. Okay, I'll have to debug it later. Okay, but now we are not jumping twice, so that's good. Maybe I'll turn the gravity down a little bit. I'll turn it down to like 600. Okay, now you can see when I jump, he's kind of like floating. So I probably need more gravity than that. But sometimes my jump is just really bad. So let's reset the gravity, and I'll have to experiment more with that later. Okay, so one thing I mentioned, if we turn off this velocity.x, so if we're not resetting the velocity.x, we're gonna get this very different thing where my player is just gonna run right off the side of the thing. So in this case, I'm not resetting the player speed, so the player slides around. And so then you would obviously need to change the speed a lot if you want this kind of effect, maybe down to like 10 or something like that. But you might like that effect. Some games use more of a sliding effect. Some don't. It kind of depends on how you like it. So now the player is pretty slow, but the more I go in one direction, the faster they go. And so then you'd have to like cap off how fast they go. So it's a little bit more complicated to make a game that has more involved physics like that. So I'm going to turn that off for now. But if that's something that you're interested in doing, you can do that by turning off this velocity.x equals 0 and then playing around with the speed value, maybe playing around with the move and slide function. There's other options for that function as well. Okay, so let's update our animations now. So I'm going to go to the update animation function. And so we are going to have to make some changes here. So in our original simple version of this, we were just basically saying if the player is moving at all, then we're going to play the walk animation. But now we have this new state where the player can be jumping. So we have to include that in our code. So let's take a look at the code. So we're going to look first at whether the player is or is not on the floor. And if the player is not on the floor, then we're going to assume that the player is jumping. So that's going to be my first condition. I'm going to say if not is on floor, then we're going to say animated sprite dot play, and we're going to use the jump. So then the next thing we can do is say elif, or else if instead of else. And so now if the player is moving, but they're on the floor, then we can play the walk animation, and otherwise we'll play the idle animation. And we may, oh yeah, actually we may need to change this to just the velocity x. Let's see if this works. Go from there. Okay, so if I'm jumping, we see that jump animation getting played. Still don't understand why he only jumps sometimes, but anyway. If I jump like twice, it's a much better jump. It's really weird. I don't know what the deal with that is, but I'll have to tweak that a little bit. Anyway, so we have the jump animation going. Let's see if the idle animation. No, so he's still walking because I'm applying the gravity. So even though he's running into the bottom of the top of the tile, he probably has just a little bit of velocity. So let's actually print out the velocity and see what those values are. I'm just going to print velocity and take a look in the output. And so you can see the velocity is getting bigger and bigger. Oh, that might be why. Velocity keeps getting bigger and bigger as long as he's standing there. So maybe I should only be applying the velocity. But wait a second, that's what's happening. Huh. Maybe this is a new thing in Godot. They do make updates from time to time. Okay. So let's see if we can fix this real quick. So I don't know if this is going to work, but I'm going to say if not is on floor. So I'll only apply the velocity if I'm jumping. This might fix that issue. Okay, there we go. That's much better. Not sure why that wasn't working before, but looks better. So I still need to update my animation because I'm not getting the idle animation. And you can see that that's still because the Y velocity is still a value. So as long as it thinks that it's moving on Y, even though it's standing on a platform, we need to change this because this is taking X and Y into account. So an easy way to change this is instead of asking if there's any velocity in any direction, I can just look at the absolute value of the X. So if the X velocity is positive, I'm moving to the right. If the X velocity is negative, I'm moving to the left. And if I check the absolute value, which I can do using ABS, this will just convert the absolute distance from 0. So if the velocity X is 200, then it's greater than 0. And if it's negative 200, the absolute value of negative 200 will also be 200. So that's an easy way to check if I'm moving right or left. So this is simple. There's a lot more complex ways to do this animation, but right now I basically have 3 possibilities. If I'm on the floor, sorry, if I'm not on the floor, I'm jumping. If I'm moving right and left, I'm walking. And if I'm not doing either of those things, then I'm just standing. So let's try this again. So if I move right and left, I walk. And if I jump, I get the jump animation. And now the jump is actually doing okay. Let's see. I I don't know if I can make this jump. I can't really make that jump. Okay, so my jump force is already way, way up. So this is, we'll talk about this more with level design, but this is what a lot of level design is checking, can I actually make this jump, and making sure the player can actually do stuff. So I can either change the jump value, or I can reset my my tiles, which is probably what I'll do. All right, so let's see. Oh, and then I have another thing to kill the player if I fall below the window. So let's add that in. And that player hit signal. Okay. See if there's anything else. Okay, let's just add this bit in, and then we'll move on. So one thing that you've probably noticed is as I'm playing, if I fall below these tiles, I just fall forever. And so there's a few different ways to handle this. One thing I could do is just go into the scene, and I could add in like a big area. I could get like a area 2D and just add in like a big invisible, I need a collision shape for that. Square. Okay. So one way I could deal with this is taking this big square and going below where my player normally is, and just making like a huge area, and basically saying if the player falls into this area, they're gonna die. And that's one way to do it. The problem with this is that you always have to make sure that this area is as big as your scene, which I don't really want to have to update this area every time I change the scene. So a way to do it with code, and that's a perfectly fine way to do things, but an easier way to do it with code is just choose basically how far below 0. So if this is 0 on the Y, how far below 0 can the player go before they die? And so I'm just going to arbitrarily kind of choose 2 height values of my window. So after I do all this stuff, I'm going to check to see if the player is still alive, basically. So I'm going to say if, and what I'm going to check for is right here. If the player is alive, and the position of the player is greater than the viewport, that's the size of the window, dot size dot y times 2. So if he's 2 viewports below where the game is, then I'm going to kill the player. So if the player is alive and position dot y, that's the player's vertical position, is greater than get viewport, so that's the game window, and then dot size, that's the size of the game window. I'm gonna run out of space. And then y, that's the vertical size of the game window, times 2. So I'm gonna have 2, he can fall 2 windows before he dies. So this way it's relative to the size of the game window. I could just put this number in here because I know what it is. The game window is 512, and so this is just 1024. But writing it like this means that if I decide to change the game window in the future, it's not gonna break the way that the code works. So if this happens, is alive equals false. So the game will stop updating. And we also want to call the emit signal. We want to tell the scene manager that our player has died. I don't know why I said a player hit here. So let's call this player died. So let's say emit signal player died. And I probably also want to play the dies animation. Oh, that's being called by the scene manager. I heard something. Did somebody have a question? So we're going to emit the signal player died to the scene manager. And so we actually have to create this signal to make sure that it works. So let's go back up here to our variables and just say, I'll put it after our member variables. I'll put signal player died. So that way we can connect it to our scene manager. And let's also just play the player dies animation. If the player falls below the surface, then it's not really ambiguous as to what's happening. So I'll say animated sprite dot play dies. I think that's what I called it. Let's check the animated sprite. Oh, I didn't add a dies animation. Okay, so I have to have a dies animation. So I'm going to click add a new animation, call it dies. Click on my waffle and go to sprites. And let's see, character idle, jump, talk, walk. I guess I didn't make a character dies animation. Must have forgotten to do that. Okay. We can add that later. I'll make one and just put it in later. So for now, I'll just put in, I'll use something from the jump animation. I'll just use this one. Just so there's something there. Kind of looks like he might have died. And I'll fill that in with a real dies animation later. Okay. So I have my player. So now if I go to node, there's a player died signal, and I can connect that to my scene manager. And so if the player dies, I can bring up like the game over menu. I don't know if I actually have that. Let's see, do I have a game over? I have the main menu. So I'll make a game over menu. I'll do that later. So for now, I'm just gonna say, I'm just gonna print player died. And we'll add in a menu in a second so we can reset the scene. Okay, so let's just test it. Okay, so if I jump down, okay, so player died. Okay, cool. So we want to be able to reset the scene. And so this is where we might need some in-game UI. And so this is a little bit different. We have this like menu scene here that we made a couple weeks ago. And it has a bunch of buttons in it and different stuff. And so that's good. But we need something for the in-game if I die or something happens. So let's make that now. So what I'm going to do is duplicate this menu scene. I'm going to duplicate this, and I'll call this game over and click duplicate. And so for the game over, we don't need all of this stuff. So let's delete some of this stuff. I'm going to delete this extra check button and the label. And we don't need the instructions. Let's delete that. And I'm going to keep the start in the quit button. So we might want to just quit the game, but we might want to try again. So I'm going to click on the start button, and all I'm going to do with this is change the art. So, oh, whoops, I'm editing my menu. I always do this. Okay, let's undo that and close this. Let's make sure we're actually editing game over and delete these things. Okay, so now I have my quit button. So I want the quit button because I can quit. The functionality is the same. And I just want to replace the art for the start button. I don't even have to rename it, but I want to make it say restart instead of start. So I'm going to get rid of those artworks, go to load, go to UI, and I have this restart button. So let's put that in there. And it's going to keep all the same other defaults. So that's kind of nice. I don't have to like get the color again or do other stuff. So I'm just going to add in my 3 restart settings. Start. Okay, so I have my restart button. And then I don't need the instructions anymore. So let's just delete this. And we could put like a little game over here. Did I create that? I can't remember. No, I didn't create that. So I should have like another game over title to put in here. I might have one in the assets folder. Let me double check. So if we go to assets, sprites, UI titles. Okay, I have a big game over image here. So let's use this one. I'm gonna copy this and throw it in sprites. Oh no, I made a different folder. UI titles. Let's paste that in there. Okay, so I'll take the title and replace this with UI titles game over. Okay. And not centered because it's not the same size as this graphic. So what I can do is add a center container. So I'll go to the title graphic, add child node, add center container. I wasn't really planning on doing UI stuff, but this is going to be useful. So I'll center this, and there we go. So we have our game over scene. And so let's go back to our platformer scene. And so this is relevant for like any in-game UI that you might want to use. If I want to add some UI that doesn't move with the camera, what I need is a separate canvas. Okay, so I can go to my platformer scene and right click, add child node. And so what I actually want here is a canvas. What is it called? Canvas layer. So I want a separate canvas layer to use for my UI so that it won't move with the rest of my scene. So I'm going to choose a new canvas layer and create. I'm going to put this up here and just call this UI. And in here, I'm going to instance the child scene and use my game over. So there's my game over. It looks like it's offset here, but if we play it in the game, so if I leave it on, whoops. Oh, I have this instructions visible equals false. Okay, so let's see. I guess I need to, let's see, assign this to, oh, okay. Didn't really think about this. I'm gonna have to say, if instructions, so if the instructions exist, then make them not visible. See if that fixes. Okay, so now we see our UI, and you can see even if I move the character through the level, the UI stays in the same place. Still have this jumping issue. I don't know what's going on. For some reason, none of my code is working the way it should be. But what we want to do is only have the UI pop up when we actually die. So I'm going to go back to game over. I want to make sure this node says game over. I'm going to save that. Go back to the platformer scene and this is game over. And so what we want to do in the scene manager is when we get the player dies signal, we'll turn the game over UI on. So we'll go back to the script. So we need to get a reference to the game over UI, just like we did in our regular UI scene. So I'll do the same thing that you can see right here. I'm going to say export node path var game over UI path, and then on ready var game over UI equals get node game over UI path. Oh, there's no thing here. And then just like I did in my other menu, in my ready function, so func underscore ready, this runs when the scene starts. I'm going to say game over UI dot visible equals false. So we'll make sure we can't see it at the beginning. Let's add a check in here as well, just in case it doesn't exist for some reason. So if GameOver UI just makes it sure that this variable actually exists. And then if our player dies, I'm going to copy this and just set this to true. And then so the last little bit of my GameOver UI is the default scene. This is what scene gets loaded when I click start. So let's make sure that it goes back to the beginning of our scene. So I'm going to choose the platformer scene, which is the scene that we're in, and give this a try. So now if I jump off, okay, so I guess this doesn't work the way I thought it did. So let's turn this off for a second and try this again. Oh, I didn't add it. I always do this. Okay, I have to go back to the scene manager and actually assign the GameOver UI. Okay, so I have this GameOver UI path. I have to actually point that to my new GameOver UI. Okay, so now I don't see the GameOver UI. If I fall, now I'm dead. And so I can click quit, and that gets rid of the window. And if I do the same thing, and I click restart, it should start me back at the beginning of my scene. Still having this weird thing with the gravity. I don't know why that's happening. It's different from how it's written in the script. Let's see, gravity times delta, and slide, x plus speed, x minus. This is the same. Okay, let's go back to the player controller. So if we're not on the floor, we're applying gravity. Let's say else then velocity dot y equals. So if we're standing on the ground, we're just going to reset the velocity. I don't know why this is acting differently. Maybe I have some settings that are different. Okay, there we go. That makes more sense because the jump force is really high. I don't know if I have different physics settings. Let's go to project setting. Let's search for, okay, 2D physics. Default engine, save. Default graph. Vector. That all seems normal. I don't know why it's behaving differently, but let's reset our jump force and see how that looks. Okay, that's closer to what I would expect. Pretty normal jump, although we still can't make this jump over here. So let's redraw that. So I'll go to my simple tile. Oops. Cut this. Put it closer. Okay. Okay, there we go. We've got our gravity working. Oh, we can't get up there. Okay. So let's quit this. So there's one more thing. Obviously, this is taking longer than I hoped. So we're probably not going to work on the obstacle stuff today, but we can work on that next week. There's one more thing that we want to add, which is illustrated by me not being able to get over here, which is the wall jump. And so this is something I want to show to go over how to deal with more complex options or conditions, but also just to give you the option if you want to have a wall jump in the game. So right now, if I hit this wall, I can't jump again, and so I'm kind of stuck. I can't get over here. So if I want to be able to add that into the game, there's another function I can use called isOnWall. And so I can go back to my script and look here. So I have if input dot is action just pressed jump and is on floor. Then velocity.y minus equals jump force, is jumping is true, enemy sprite.frame equals 0. So all that stuff looks good. But if I want to add in a wall jump, that makes things a little bit more complicated. So I could say and is on floor or is on wall. And this is like one big condition. So you can see our code is getting a little bit more complicated. But I also need these to be in parentheses. So now what's going to happen, so if you have more complicated conditions, you're going to have more complicated code structures. So this if statement is now asking if I hit the jump button, but I'm also asking if I'm either on the floor or on the wall. And that is one condition together. So if I'm not either on the floor or on the wall, then this whole thing is going to be false. And I need to evaluate these two things separately. So let's see. Now I should be able to jump. Oop. Right again. Okay, now I should be able to jump. And yeah, now I can jump if I'm hitting this wall. Okay, the one thing that this introduces that makes things tricky is it's hard to demonstrate this because this isn't a big wall. Let's add a little bit to the wall. Oh, this tile map isn't really designed for this, but okay, let's see it. Okay, so now I can do double jumps because I have this more complex system. So another way to change this script is instead of saying if I'm on the floor or I'm on the wall, so now I can do a double jump because if I'm not on the floor but I am on the wall, then this is going to work. Then I can use this is jumping is true. So if I'm already jumping, then I don't want to be able to jump again. But I also need to be able to reset that. So the logic of these systems can get kind of tricky. So one way that we can do that is by separating out our statements. So you can see in the example, first I evaluate if I can jump. So if I can jump, I'm either on the floor or I'm on the wall. And I had another value here, wall jump enabled, but I'm just going to leave that out for now. You guys can add this in the code if you want to, but it's just kind of an option to either enable it or disable it depending on the level. But let's keep it a little bit more simple. So now I can say if the input is jump and I can jump, then we're going to add in our jump. And I'm missing the other. Sorry, I'm having a lot of. Oh, here we go. Okay. Oh, I took this out because of the sound effects, but we're not going to deal with the sound effects for now. We're just going to add in the code here. Okay, so to simplify this, we can make an extra variable. We can say variable is on, or variable can jump is on floor or is on wall. And so we can replace this whole thing with can jump. And then we can also use our is jumping. So is jumping, so we can say and not is jumping. So this tells us whether we're already jumping, because is jumping only happens if we started a jump. But because there's multiple conditions through which we can be jumping, if we want to reset jumping, we have to check if we're on the floor or on the wall first. So we can say if is on floor or is on wall, is jumping equals false. Okay, so this is a little bit more complicated, but it's going to get rid of that problem if I can actually demonstrate it. Okay. So let's see if I jump, whoops. Okay, yeah, so I can jump here, and I'm having a hard time actually playing it. Okay, there we go. So we have the double jump. Okay, so sorry, this is way more complicated than I remembered it being. But anyway, there's different ways to do this. You don't have to have a wall jump, so you could just ignore all of this and just go with the is jumping. But if you want to add sound later, which we will do eventually, this is also a useful structure to have in place. All right, so I'm going to stop there. Sorry about that. I ended up covering more stuff than I anticipated, especially the UI stuff. I kind of forgot about that. So let me stop recording.